Hi, I'm Debbie Ingram, and this is Town Meeting TV. And in our attempts to keep up with all the political goings-on in Vermont, we wanted to do a welcome interview with a new reporter at 7 Days, one of the state's premier publications. That's why my guest today is Hannah Bassett. Welcome, Hannah. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great. So I wanted to, first of all, let's kind of introduce you to our viewers. You recently came to Vermont to work at 7 Days, but you're not entirely new to New England, right? So can you tell us about your background and experience?
Yeah, I'm originally from New Hampshire, Granite Stater. I have family who are in Vermont, so I'm familiar with the Green Mountain State as well. But I came to Vermont at the beginning of this year to start this new position with 7 Days covering the State House. This role is covering the State House with this Ways and Means series that we're looking at kind of how the State House operates in this modern day and age. My background, though, is in investigative reporting. I came from an investigative newsroom in Arizona where I was covering health disparities for a newsroom there. And prior to that, I worked for a U.S. Congressperson in New Hampshire, Representative Annie Custer, for those who might be familiar with our neighbors to the east. And after that, I worked for a number of nonprofit organizations, mostly in the government transparency and accountability space. So this Ways and Means position really feels like a great fusion of this government accessibility, government transparency, and how Vermont's citizen legislature is operating in this modern age.
Great, and I think I read also that you your undergraduate degree is from Tufts, and you have a master's degree from Stanford, right? We have Stanford in common because my undergraduate degree is from Stanford. So
terrific!
I'm sure we both feel fortunate to have gone to that school, and so good to have little things in common. Yes, let's talk more about your Ways and Means series. That's why you've been specifically hired. Could you describe for us the goals and purpose of this series?
So Vermont has this citizen legislature, as I mentioned. It's an institution that's incredibly storied. It's evolved over the centuries that it's been in place, but in many ways it's, working to meet this modern era. So I think there were questions that our newsroom was hearing from constituents and from other folks approaching our editors and publishers about exactly what that was looking like in this year, 2025, and how these systems were evolving to meet the modern challenges and the modern problems that were coming before the state and before the legislature. So this beat that I'm reporting on is really looking at the ways and the means of kind of how the legislature is tackling these challenges. So it's looking at how the legislature is rising to the challenge and exactly where it's succeeding and where it might have room for improvement, where there might be best practices that other citizen legislatures in the country may have found solutions or practices that could help aid better transparency or better outcomes for the state.
Yeah, it's a good point that Vermont has certainly come a long way, right? In the 1700s when the legislature was started, and it was primarily, I think, farmers. Actually, it was landed men were actually the first people who were able to vote, and then much less serve in office. And then, so we've come now. We're in 2025, and we've found, I think, not just in our state, but all across the nation, that some of our institutions haven't necessarily evolved to reflect that almost 300-year history. So
right,
yeah.
It's a process, of course, and I've spoken with a lot of folks who have this incredible historical perspective, and a lot of legislators who are in the State House today have been there and seen and advocated for a lot of the change, but it's a continuous process, of course. There's always more that can be done, so I think this reporting is just continuing that conversation as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So far, you've published some very interesting articles, which I've taken a look at. You started with, I think, ethics disclosures that legislators have to turn in. And then the idea of legislators holding more than one elected office, which is pretty common in Vermont. You also did an article on the workload of the legislative legal staff. There are very few of them, and they have quite a lot to do. And then your most recent articles on lobbyists, but specifically on the education lobbyists from that lens. How do you think that so far, what's your impression of how these aspects of the institution influence the effectiveness of lawmaking?
Well, it's been all four of those stories have kind of taken a look at very different parts of the State House and very different aspects of how this specific legislative session has unfolded. But I think they've helped shine a light on different parts of what keeps the citizen legislature running. For the instance, the piece about the Office of Legislative Counsel, for folks who might not be as intimately familiar with different components of the State House and the state legislature, that's the group of professional staff within the State House who, many of them are attorneys, legal staff who help research and write the bills that eventually become laws. They work very closely with the legislators, representatives and senators, the committees, to write the bills. They have an immense amount of work during the legislative session. They work year-round, but during these 5 months or so that legislators are reporting each week to Montpelier, it's a Herculean task, folks say, and they do a tremendous amount of work. But it's, I think, for folks who aren't day in and day out, they might not be aware that there is this relatively limited pool of resources of professional staff available to legislators to help make that possible. And it has a tremendous amount of influence on the quality and the quantity of laws and output that legislators are able to create each year. It's a very limited resource that legislators have, since most elected officials don't have professional staff there. In terms of the lobbyists involved in this year's education reform, which is the biggest kind of legislative effort before legislators this year in the State House this year, that I think helped shine a light on this outside presence of expertise that comes into the State House that legislators often do embrace because they don't have as much professional staff to assist them, besides the Office of Legislative Counsel or Joint Fiscal Office, who provide more of a fiscal perspective if needed. So I think these pieces have looked at kind of the different dynamics at play that keep that institution running, but it's provided a bit of a varied look at the institution as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for that. Yeah, as you know, I'm a former state senator myself, and particularly those two that you've highlighted, were very influential in my time in the legislature. I mean, the Herculean is absolutely the adjective to use about how difficult it is, and just the sheer volume of work that that Leg Council, has, and how much the various committees depend on the attorneys. And it is interesting. We have a citizens legislature, and most of us who serve don't really know how to write, even draft, legislation that really meets all the legal qualifications or will stand constitutional scrutiny and that kind of thing. So there's a great dependence on the lawyers. And then, I was kind of surprised, really, frankly, when I first went into the legislature to see the trust that legislators have in the lobbyists here in Vermont. And, I think that speaks well of Vermont on the one hand. The lobbyists are not considered to be sort of evil people who are scheming behind the scenes, but they are actually knowledgeable people about the issues that they are talking to legislators about. And a lot of legislators really rely on them for the facts and figures and data about the issues that they're working on.
Yeah, I've heard many folks, including several legislators themselves, say it's one of Vermont's greatest strengths, but also greatest weaknesses, that it is a citizen legislator, and that a lot of folks coming into the State House do not have this deep policy expertise necessarily or legislative expertise to know how to write these bills or to have maybe the deep policy expertise on the committee that they might end up on. And speaking with, for example, a parent who has a child with special needs with education for this story about the education reform efforts. She ran up against education policy that was passed recently that left her child without the resources that her child needed in schools, and she approached legislators about it. And it seemed that to her that it was maybe an oversight in a law that was passed recently that left a bit of a gap in resources that should have been available to students like her child. And the legislators recognized that there was maybe a gap in the legislation that they passed, and they recognized that it would be able to be fixed in the next year's session, and they would kind of adjust that with a technical correction bill or with a new law. But that maybe that wouldn't have happened if there were, greater expertise in the legislature or greater continuity in the legislature. But it's a really big challenge for citizen legislature coming through, or with a legislative council that just has an immense amount of demands on it. And it's a really big challenge that legislators themselves are very mindful of as well.
Mm-hmm. And personally, I think that sometimes Vermont is criticized for passing study committees, right? That we often resort to, to that. But I think again, it goes back to this idea of when you have a citizen legislature, people don't necessarily know. I mean, they want some group that's a little more well versed in something to actually take the time to study it and to report back. So I think that's where a lot of that impetus comes from. So when people ask me about that, I always defend the study committees, because that's just one example from my experience anyway. But what other topics are you planning on covering? Do you have a list of some other things you want to?
Certainly a long list. I think the session only has about a month or so left. There's a few question marks there with how long the education reform bill or the budget bill might extend the session this year. Typically the session wraps up sometime in mid or late May. But this summer and fall will be a bit of a different rhythm to this reporting area. But as you mentioned, there's always these studies that extend through the summer. The work certainly continues for a lot of these legislators. Many of them are drafting bills, working with legislative council, for example. Of course, talking with their constituents back in their home communities throughout the summer. So there'll be many lines of reporting, absolutely. And I'm talking with my editors all the time about what we might be reporting on. But we have more stories coming for between now and the end of the session as well.
Great. Do you anticipate that, you mentioned you were an investigative reporter, do you anticipate that some of this will reveal changes that might be made in how the legislature works? Is that part of your, in the back of your mind as you're doing the reporting?
That's always in the back of my mind. My background is in this world of government accountability and transparency, and I think in some ways as the press pool in Vermont and in the State House has shrunk over the years, there's always kind of room to be going deeper there, and my position with 7 days is a tremendous opportunity to have more time to be able to do that. There are incredible reporters who are in the State House day in and day out, don't get me wrong, and they are covering so much going on there. So credit where credit is due. There is tremendous reporting that people can be and should be following every day, but I hope to be going into those deeper dive investigative stories. And I think the summer months where there's less kind of daily events will provide an opportunity to do that. There's absolutely stories and kind of concerns that I've talked with legislators about throughout the session that might require more time with public records requests, things that take just a little more time to follow the threads of that I'm looking forward to getting into. And I think, as with any kind of government institution, there's opportunity to bring more transparency and accountability to. So in short, yes, and I'm really looking forward to getting into that.
Yeah, well, I look forward to reading what you uncover. Well, I'd also like to ask you a little bit about journalism more broadly. So, I mean, American journalism has been in serious transition for the last several years in many respects, switching from print to digital, losing funding, which results in the closure of publications or the laying off of reporters. Relying more on social media, not just for distribution of information, but also for collection of information, going away from professional reporters. And a general lack of faith in journalism because of accusations of quote-unquote fake news. So how do you see journalism in general continuing to evolve amid all of those pressures?
It certainly needs to keep evolving. I think the shaking of the public's trust in journalism is a real threat to our democracy. Journalism and the media, historically, as you probably know, has been referred to as the fourth estate, and it's, I think, served a really important presence in our society to hold power to account, folks often say, and I think that is something that has served our society well, but that's been made possible with a foundation built on trust and knowing that what folks might be reading in the news they consume is based on fair, fact-based, accountable, trustworthy journalism. And it's great in many ways that that journalism and media has become more accessible to more voices. I think for a lot of years, just like the State House was in the early days, as you mentioned at the start of our conversation, it was a closed community to only a certain set of voices and identities. It's great that it's become more accessible through more mediums. It's become digital. It's become, a lot more democratized. But I think media literacy and helping folks know how to identify the media sources that know kind of the journalistic ethics that can ensure the information that's being shared is trustworthy, is fact-based, is accurate, is ethically gathered, is transparent, kind of all of those core tenets that undergird what we think of as objective news, I think is most important. So I worry that media literacy has been shaken a little bit, and making sure that folks know how to parse that out when there is such a cacophony of news and content out there. I'm glad that it's a lot easier for folks to get information in a lot of ways, but I want to make sure that the information that is reaching the most people is accurate and is helping support an informed society.
Right. Well, we appreciate your role in that, and 7 Days. We at Town Meeting TV, we often partner with 7 Days, and a lot of times we talk about Vermont exceptionalism, but I think that that's another area in which we are able to bring some robust support of our democracy by trying to ensure that we have professional reporting, and that we do have accurate reporting that people can trust. So thank you for what you do, and thanks for coming in and speaking with me. So I'm Debbie Ingram, and I've been speaking with Hannah Bassett, 7 Days new Ways and Means reporter. Remember to stay tuned to Town Meeting TV for all the latest on the political scene in Vermont. Take care.